Ideas do have consequences in history, yet not because those ideas are inherently truthful or obviously correct, but rather because of the way they are embedded in very powerful institutions, networks, interests, and symbols. James Davison Hunter.
In the United States, from 1945 through 1975, the House of Un-American Activities Committee impacted the relationship between citizens and government because of the HUAC's tactics in unconstitutional ways, leading to its eventual termination.
The HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, was a committee created by the U.S. House of Representatives to investigate un-American activities throughout the United States. Created in 1938, the committee would target thought to be fascist groups right before the Second World War.
Prominent in America during the Second World War, the committee was created by the government so the United States could investigate un-American activities and make America a safer place. During this time, a lot of people thought that their security was at risk and they felt threatened by fascists and communists, especially during the Red Scares, certain time periods in America where communists were considered a rising threat to the United States.
After World War II, the committee became more aggressive in their investigations and had controversial tactics to get rid of certain groups like fascists and communists because of claims that communists and their ideals invaded the general industry and government. Their main tactics, put simply, were subpoenas and blacklists. The suspects would be called in front of the HUAC, where they'd be questioned about many different things, like about their political beliefs or other possible people involved in any activities they would be allegedly taking part in. After the questioning and other discussions throughout the small event, the person or people depending on the outcome we sentenced to prison, blacklisted, or in rare cases, set free. People refusing to cooperate would also be sent to prison depending on the amount of evidence against them. Critics stated that the tactics from 1945 through 1969 were like a witch hunt that went against U.S. citizens' rights and ruined careers and reputation.
They contributed a good amount to the Red Scare. When the Cold War was beginning to peak, the threat that communists implied began to be known as the Red Scare. HUAC often pressured bystanders and witnesses to give up the names of people involved and other useful information that could help put the people involved in the Red Scare away. The main Red Scare happened after World War II when America was worried about communists taking over. This was known as the Cold War. The Cold War was significant because it was a time where nuclear war was a threat and communist invasion was nothing but official. Throughout, both countries spent these years building up knowledge and weaponry as if preparing for battle. With all these things coming to spies, America was paranoid about spies in this time and used HUAC to make sure the United States was safe. Although this was one effective way of doing it, it also went very wrong. A lot of innocent people were thrown in jail because of the suspicion of HUAC. Some people were never even released. Another precaution besides eliminating spies America did was the loyalty order. The loyalty order was a precaution ordered by the former President Harriet S. Truman that all government officials were to be interviewed and investigated to make sure they were loyal to the government and had no associations with the Soviet Union. This was unusual and some even say unconstitutional because one of America's most prized valuables is personal liberty and freedom.
One of the biggest investigations done around the time was of the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 was a group of film writers and directors. When the group was called to stand in front of the committee, they refused to answer a lot of questions and that they were communists, and after publicly spoke about the HUAC's tactics and how they were wrong. They were charged with contempt of Congress. Edward Dmytryk was a member of the Hollywood 10 and was a director of many propaganda films. Dmytryk, like the other members of the Hollywood 10, would not cooperate properly with the HUAC and got blacklisted from the film industry in the U.S. He then moved to England to make more films until he was forced back to the U.S. to renew his passport, where he was then sentenced to prison for contempt of Congress like the rest of the Hollywood 10. While in prison, he cooperated with the HUAC and admitted to being a part of the American Communist Party, as well as gave the HUAC the names of 26 other people. This allowed him to return to Hollywood, being the only member of the Hollywood 10 to do so. This investigation would start a debate about the controversial tactics and the morally wrong tactics of the HUAC, leading to the committee's slow downfall.
Another investigation by the HUAC in 1948, a man named Whittaker Chambers, senior editor for Time magazine, was called to be in front of the HUAC. In the process of his hearing, Chambers admitted to being part of an underground communist system that helped the Soviet Union in the 1930s, before the Second World War. During this hearing, Chambers confirmed an allegation that the U.S. government official Alger Hiss also helped the Soviet Union in the same group as Chambers before World War II. Even though having no proof that this was true, Hiss denied the allegation because of this and almost proved himself to be not guilty of the accusation at hand. But as some members thought he wasn't guilty because of the zero evidence provided in the multiple claims from the chambers, other members, such as at the time Congressman Richard Nixon, pushed for the investigation to continue. Throughout the committee, from time it was being investigated, Alger Hiss's involvement with the Soviet Union and the ideas of communism were controversial. But then, in December of 1948, Chambers provided the committee documents that were hidden inside a pumpkin on his farm in Maryland. These documents had good evidence that Alger Hiss was guilty of Chambers' allegation, and he was charged with pre-jury, but not of espionage because 10 years had passed since he allegedly committed the crime. Alger Hiss was arrested January of 1950 for 5 years. This investigation helped prove that for some that the Soviets were infiltrating the government during the Cold War and had convinced some that the HUAC were doing good for America.
Operation Abolition was a propaganda film created by HUAC to portray negative views on not only communists, but also citizens, organizations, and even schools in America after a student protest in 1960. The goal of this film was to convince Americans that universities like Stafford and UC Berkeley were un-American. This film was a disaster and only put HUAC in a worse situation and only fueled its decide. Many big newspapers were writing about the failure and how bad it was, like the Washington Post.
In May of 1960, the HUAC held hearings in San Francisco to investigate supposed communist subversion. Although these hearings only lasted a couple days, a lot happened. During these hearings, hundreds of students from different universities like Stanford and UC Berkeley peacefully protested at the courthouse and near it. Students went up the stairs to find the courthouse was locked, so instead they stood outside the doors asking to be let in. Inside the courtroom, protesters throughout the hearing chanted "Open the door" and were asking the committee what they were afraid of. Students waited for a long time, hoping to be let in, but most of the seats had been taken by mysterious, unknown HUAC supporters. As hours went on, more and more students arrived, but the new demonstrators found that there were no space, so they protested from the outside. Near the end of the hearing, it became such a problem that firefighters from the Bay Area had to spray demonstrating students with a power hose and wash them down the steps, leaving many injured. But this did not help or scare citizens. National news claimed this to be a dangerous riot. This enraged people that were against HUAC, and instead of a few hundred protesters, there were 5,000 students on the final day of the hearings.
Throughout the lifespan of the HUAC, some citizens thought that the HUAC was necessary for America's internal security, while others thought that the HUAC took away freedom from American citizens. Almost half of Americans favored punishing those who didn't cooperate or agree with the HUAC's opinions, which over time people believed less and less in. It is high time that the people of the United States start recognizing this committee for what it is, an instrument of the U.S. reaction to thwart, misrepresentation, and destroying all attempts of the democratic loving persons of this country to keep and strengthen their Constitution. Jesus Colon to the Walter Committee on Un-American Activities at Foley Square, New York City, November 16, 1959.
The termination of HUAC took place throughout about 20 years. It was a large and significant piece of history. HUAC termination is said to have begun when President Harry Truman declared HUAC to be one of the most un-American things in current time. Obviously, since he was president, many people followed his lead and path that he had created. Although HUAC hung on, many events led to its demise. For example, the student protests of 1960. For their own use of propaganda, while all things were not looking good for this committee, in 1975 it was declared that HUAC and all activity members of the committee were to be sent to House Jurisdiction Committee, and HUAC was fully terminated.
Throughout the HUAC's entire history, there was always controversy. Controversy of if the HUAC in America was handling foreign beliefs from their own properly or not. There were always debates from citizens to citizens and from citizens to the government about this topic, and the longer and longer the committee was around, the more and more people started to show disbelief in this committee until there were a mutual agreement from most citizens and most parts of the government that this committee should cease to exist, creating the end of the HUAC and the end of this documentary.